Hi, this is Mandy. Today I'm gonna show you, I think, what I'm gonna call it the final guide to your perfect English tea scone. I think this video is kind of 10 years in the making because for the past 10 years I have been struggling to find a perfect English tea scone recipe that doesn't look like a biscuit. When I say the perfect English tea scone, I mean it by when you go to like a fancy hotel for like an afternoon tea, those teeny tiny scones that you get, that is super tall and it looks much sturdier than a scone with a single crack in the middle. That recipe has been elusive for me for the past 10 years, that because all the recipes that I've tried online, and there are a lot, they always kind of produces scones that kind of looks like a biscuit or tastes like a biscuit. And today I feel like I finally nailed down the recipes that I think is perfect. So I'm going to show you how. So the first thing I'm going to do is to prepare the wet ingredients, okay? I'm preparing the wet ingredients first simply because once I get my hands dirty, I don't want to wash my hands, in the middle. So number one, eggs, okay? So I'm going to crack an egg into this container and I'm going to beat it. There we go. Once you have the egg beaten, I want you to take 1 full tablespoon of the egg out of the cup and then set it into another small cup. And this is gonna be your egg wash, okay? We're not gonna add any liquid to it. We're gonna, so it's a pure egg wash, okay? So 1 tablespoon, take it out, 1 large egg, take it out of that cup and I set it aside, okay? And then here I'm going to add the rest of the wet ingredients, which brings me to mistake number 1 that people make when they make scone, and that is it's not rich enough. So I feel like that is a result because of the confusion with the biscuit, because usually biscuit uses buttermilk or milk. It's light, it's fluffy. But I feel like scone should be much more buttery and crumbly, richer in texture. It's just all in all a more decadent treat. So instead of milk, which most recipes call for, I'm going to use a combination of heavy cream and plain yogurt. So obviously both brings fat to the party. So you may ask, well, okay, if I want more fat, why don't I just use more butter? Because if you use too much butter in your dough, it's gonna cause the scone to warp too much when it's baking. So we're gonna make up for the lack of richness with heavy cream and yogurt. And then why yogurt? Because yogurt obviously it has a little bit of acidity and it just brings another flavor to the party. So I'm gonna add in here. Make sure that you get all of it into the cup. Again, the detailed recipes will be included in the link in the caption. And if you're watching this from my blog, then obviously the recipe is going to be included in the page, okay? So mix this together. You're gonna get like a thick texture mixture here, okay? Okay, once you have that, set it aside. So here I have my flours, all-purpose flour, nothing fancy, 2 cups. That brings me to mistake number 2, and that is a very big one. So mistake number 2, way too much baking powder. I have basically skimmed all the recipes in Google page 1 and 2 when you Google English tea scones, and all of it requires at least 1 tablespoon of baking powder to 2 cups of flour. it's just way too much. And I feel like that is because also a result of the confusion between a biscuit and a scone, that most biscuits, they want that, you know, full rice and puff, and, you know, almost like a puff pastry kind of, and they want that lift. Okay, so most biscuits calls for a lot of baking powder, but scone, again, like I said, it's a very different animal. And if you've ever bought scones from a crappy bakery or whatever, or you've made recipes that requires a lot of baking powders in your scone, I don't know, like you might have noticed that it leaves a astringent and dry mouth feel, almost kind of like you've just eaten spinach kind of mouthfeel in your mouth when you eat the scones. And that is because I'm no food scientist, obvious, but I've done research on this, and usually that is because there is just too much acid, okay, from the baking powder, because baking powder has cream of tartar to counter the bitter taste of the baking soda. So there's just too much acid in the scone that's causing that dry mouthfeel, or that astringent, spinachy mouthfeel. So in your scone here, I'm only going to use 1 teaspoon of baking powder plus 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. There. And because I have yogurt, which is an acidic food, in my wet ingredients, so it's going to neutralize that bitter taste from the baking powder that I'm adding. Okay, so only 1 teaspoon baking powder and then 1/4 teaspoon baking soda. That's all you need. So now we're gonna season the dry ingredients, which brings me to mistake number 3. Most scones recipes are simply just not seasoned enough. Okay, again, scone is not a biscuit. It shouldn't taste like a biscuit. It should be much sweeter, much more decadent. So here I'm using light brown sugar because flavors. 3 tablespoons of light brown sugar and half a teaspoon, I'm gonna say a full, slightly heaping half teaspoon of fine sea salt. Most recipes would say 1/4 teaspoon, just not enough. So now I have all the dry ingredients in here, and I'm just going to mix it up first with my hands. So once it's, you know, sort of incorporated, I'm going to add butter. Nothing special about the butter, just, you know, semi-grams of butter. The difference is in the mixing. So in a scone recipe, different from a biscuit, you don't want the butter to in pea-sized chunks or little disc or whatever. You actually want to work the butter completely into the flour. Okay, so what you're gonna do is basically you are going to keep mixing and crumbling the butter and the flour together until the whole thing kind of looks like fine cornmeal. Okay, you're not going to be able to feel or see any solid butter that is still left in the mixture, and this is going to take a while. I'm just gonna keep working the flour. You're gonna want to, like, you know, squeeze it hard and then crumble it. Squeeze it and then crumble it. You just have to sift through the flour almost to see that if there are any solid pieces left. Okay, so now I have mixed it enough that the mixture is, the flour is going to become yellow because of the butter, and it's just going to become kind of like a fine cornmeal texture, and when you squeeze one in your hand, it can kind of clump up together into like a ball like this. That's when you're ready. Okay, I'm gonna add my wet ingredients into the dry ingredients, and that brings me to mistake number 4. Most scone recipes out there are simply just too wet. And that, I think, again, is because of the confusion between a biscuit and the scone. A dough of a scone should be, in my opinion, just a tad bit drier. Here you see I'm trying to scrape every single last drop of the wet ingredients into the mixture so I get the correct measurement. And when you're mixing the scones, you're gonna realize this dough is a bit drier than most of the recipes, and that is actually the correct consistency. So what I'm gonna do now, instead of mixing with my hands, because I just don't want to get my hands really messy, I'm going to use a spatula, and I'm just going to make circular motions, and I'm just gonna keep folding the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients. And in the beginning, you're gonna be like, okay, this is way too dry. It's not really coming together. And you're gonna think that, oh my God, in order to mix these two together, there's gonna be way too much mixing. Which brings me to mistake number 5. Most scone recipes would tell you, do not knead or do not overwork the dough. Guess what? Wrong. You actually want to knead the dough. Not like a bread, obviously. You're not trying to, get like a solid gluten-rich dough, but you actually do want to knead the dough, I mean, not bread. A lot more than you are willing to do to a biscuit dough. And I'm basically folding it, and then I'm pressing it down, okay? I lift up one corner and I press it down. Now, once you feel like you have a cohesive dough and that your hands are not gonna get way too messy, now is the time that you actually want to get your hands in there, okay? Again, the same motion, I'm just lifting it up and I'm pressing it down. So the dough picks up all the loose flours and crumbs and whatnots when you want to get it together into a cohesive dough. And once you feel like all the crumbs and stuff have been picked up and there's not really any loose crumbs inside the bowl, like everything is kind of together into one ball like this, that's when you transfer this onto, you can remove the bowl and you can start working it out on the counter. So the question is, I guess, how do you know how much kneading? How do you know when to stop? How I tell is when it's just on the cusp of forming gluten. So what that means is it's just on the cusp of when you press the dough down, you feel like it wants to bounce back a little bit, just a little bit, okay? Like I said, again, not like a bread. This shouldn't be like a bread, okay? But don't add any more flour to this, okay? If it's sticking slightly to your counter, use a scraper to simply scrape it up, because you don't want to mess up the ratio here. Okay. So you want to knead it just until you feel like when you press it down, it's kind of resisting you slightly, just ever slightly, and that the surface is sort of kind of smoother like this instead of crumbly, okay? That's when you know that it's ready, okay? And when you press it down, you feel like it's starting to spring back just slightly, but not a lot, okay? Not a lot. Now we're ready to roll the dough out. So just a little bit of flour, not too much, just to prevent it from sticking. And this brings me to the next mistake, okay? Usually, most scone recipe would tell you to roll it out into 1 inch. I don't think that's high enough. I know this sounds totally splitting hair, but I think the perfect height of the dough that you're rolling out is 1/8 inch. So you want it to roll it out high enough, because again, this is not a biscuit. You're not going to get that much lift and puff in the oven. So you want to start the biscuit tall. So here I'm simply just going to roll it out, and I'm going to use a pastry cutter and the flat side of the pastry cutter to press down the dough so I get a very leveled surface. And I'm going to measure the height of the dough, which is perfect. Okay, now we're ready to cut. And that would be the next mistake, is that your scone is too big. Scone should be tiny, okay? So 2 inches diameter max, okay? So this is exactly what this cutter is, 2 inches, okay? So number one, you're gonna, the first cut, you won't be able to pick up any flour, but the first cut is, I'm going to press it down very, very slowly without any twisting. If you press it down too quick, you are going to flatten the dough, okay? And I'm gonna gently push it. The first one is always harder because it doesn't have the flour to prevent it from sticking, okay? I'm just gonna gently shake it a little bit to release it, okay? So that's the first one. And then you're gonna, from now on, your cutter is gonna be a little bit sticky. So dip it in flour, tap it to get any excess flour out, and then you make the next cut. And then again, you gently shake the cutter to release the dough. And you just repeat this. Now, gather the scrap, and you're gonna knead it again back into a cohesive dough. And again, you don't want any cracks, okay? So what I do is I cut my hands with the doughs inside my hands, and I really, really squeeze it down so that I'm going to force all the cracks, all the separations in the dough to kind of stick back together without rolling, without kneading it too much, okay? So now, once you feel like you have a smooth kind of a dough again, you can roll it out again into 1 inch, 1/8 inch. And you want to get it into a shape where you can maximize, you can cut out as many scones in one go as possible. So for me, that is a long rectangle, okay? So I can do one on the top and one on the bottom. Again. Now I can get one more scone out of this, so I'm going to do that. And the last piece I'm just going to throw away. I mean, if you're obsessed about it, you can put it into a little ball and bake that too, okay? But I'm not going to. So there. If you've done everything right, you're gonna get exactly 7 scones. How many number of mistakes I've said? Anyways, next mistake, okay? People don't let the scones, the doughs at least, rest before it's baked. These have to rest in the fridge for at least 30 minutes to 40 minutes, which is why I don't preheat my oven in the beginning. When I start the recipe, I preheat the oven after the scones are cut That forces me to give the scone enough time, like 30-40 minutes, depending how fast your oven heats up, for the scone to rest in the fridge. And that is important because there is a little bit of a gluten that has formed in these dough. So you want those gluten to be able to relax. And secondly, you want the flour to have time to hydrate from all the wet ingredients. So, and there is one extra benefit of doing this. And I'm not gonna say this is a mistake because it's not really. It's just if you're anal about perfection, is that if you buy scones from fancy bakeries or fancy hotels or whatever, you're gonna realize that it has a super shiny cap. It's shinier than what you would usually get from your normal egg wash. And here I'm gonna show you how to do that. How do you do that is actually you're gonna apply double layers of egg wash to the cap of the scone. So before it goes into the fridge, you're gonna give it the first layer of egg wash. And you're going to leave the tray uncovered in the fridge. And what that's gonna do is it's going to slightly dry out this first layer of egg wash. And that is going to allow you to apply the second layer of egg wash before it goes into the oven. So in the fridge. So when your scones are in the fridge resting, okay, this is when you preheat your oven. Which brings me to the next mistake that most scone recipes make, is that their oven is not hot enough. I'm going to preheat the oven to 210 Celsius. Usually most scone recipes would call for 200. And I feel like, this is just my personal experience, I feel like when the temperature of the oven is not hot enough, it's going to cause the scone to warp too much. You know, too much droopage, okay, if that's a word. Like in a classic iconic scone, you want just a tiny bit of droopage, but not too much droopage. You don't want the whole thing to fall over. So I feel like the hot temperature, 210 Celsius, okay? And we're gonna start hot, and that's going to cook the exterior of the scone first, and then when the inside starts to cook in a later stage, that's what's going to cause the scone to have that crack in the middle. The oven is now preheated, and I've just taken the scones out of the fridge, and I hope you can see that the first layer of the egg wash has now dried slightly. And that's going to allow you to apply the second layer, okay, which I'm doing right now. And this double layer of egg wash is what's gonna make the scone super shiny. And remember, do not add water in your egg wash, okay? This is pure beaten egg. And now into the oven it goes. So the scones need about 15 minutes in the oven. But because I'm starting the oven slightly hotter than what most recipes requires, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna put the timer on 10 minutes, and then after 10 minutes I'm going to turn off the oven and then let the scone sit in the oven for the next 5 minutes to finish cooking. So because the oven is hotter, if I just let it go all 15 minutes in the oven, it's gonna get too brown. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. The scones have just came out of the oven, and some are absolutely perfect and some are not so perfect, but I'm glad it turned out that way because I can show you exactly why. The scones are out, and as you can see, some of them are very perfect, like this one, and some of them are not so perfect, like this one. That's what I call too much droopage. Whereas you want your scone to be like this one. Slightly lopsided with a single crack in the middle. So, now, you may ask, exactly the same recipe, baked in exactly the same oven, done by exactly the same person, what is causing the scones to come out differently in your oven. And here's what I'm going to tell you. This is exactly why when you form the scones, you want the scones to be leveled. So what I did with this scone here is because after I've cut the scones from the dough and trying to release it onto the sheet pan, by pressing it to get it out of the cutter, right? So when I do that, I have dented one side of the scone. And then now that it's in the pan, it's already, from the starting point, it was already lopsided. Well, like when the top and the bottom is not perfectly parallel, I guess, okay? Because the scone is gonna wanna expand. So naturally, if it's already lopsided, the expansion is gonna cause the lopsidedness to go completely crazy, like this one. Sorry. Okay, but if your scone starts with the top and bottom perfectly paralleled, you're going to get a perfect, slightly lopsided scones like this. Okay? Now, some of you may be thinking, so who cares if my scones looks like a biscuit? It's not tall like this, it doesn't have a single crack in the middle. Who cares? It tastes just as great. Well, I'm gonna argue that those people don't understand the full experience of eating an English tea scone. The full experience of eating an English tea scone is not just in the taste and texture, but also in the initial split. So what that single crack in the middle allows is a perfectly split, half split of a scone every single time. And this is important because scones are not meant to be eaten alone. It's supposed to be eaten with clotted cream, with jam, and all that kind of good stuff. And the perfect split is really important because it becomes the perfect vessel for all those toppings. And if you have a scone that doesn't have that single crack in the middle, and when you crack it open, you know, the cap comes off, and then you have like a third of the top and 2/3 of the bottom. I don't know, it just pisses me off. Okay, maybe it doesn't piss you off, but it pisses me off. So I hope that you make this recipe, and if you are one of those doubters or those people who thinks that, you know, a scone is, as you know, if it's good to eat, it's fine enough. I hope this recipe changes your mind. Yeah, that's it. See you next time. If you're watching this from YouTube, this is just a cooking demo video for the recipe that is posted on my blog, ladyandpups.com. So the recipe is not going to be, the detailed recipe at least, is not going to be included in this video. So if you're looking for the detailed recipes, I'm gonna include the link in the caption so you can directly go to my blog for the recipes and the detailed measurements.